Chapter 1. Alexandria, Ocasio-Cortez. The energy sweeping through Nevada that day was something far more volatile than the dry desert heat. It was the raw, kinetic force of a movement on the verge of transformation. What had started as passionate opposition was now something else entirely, a surging wave of defiance, disillusionment, and determination that refused to be boxed in by the boundaries of traditional politics. In the heart of Reno, inside a packed and sweltering auditorium where every seat was filled and every wall reverberated with chants and cheers, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez took the stage like a lightning rod drawing power from the storm. Overhead, bold banners hung from steel rafters bearing the name of her latest campaign, Fighting Oligarchy, Power to the People Tour. The slogan wasn't just a rallying cry, it was a gauntlet thrown at the feet of Washington's elite. The audience was electric, a living, breathing force of working-class grit and activist urgency. Fans whirred uselessly overhead, unable to keep pace with the packed bodies and the intensity of the moment. Faces glistened with sweat, hands were raised in clenched solidarity, and every cheer that erupted from the crowd felt like a battle drum pounding out a message. We're done waiting. AOC stood center stage with the poise of someone who had long since shed the caution of political newcomers. Her trademark rolled-up sleeves signaled not just readiness, but resolve, as she surveyed the crowd with sharp, knowing eyes. When she spoke, her voice didn't merely echo. It cut through the thick atmosphere like a blade honed by years of frustration and unmet promises. "This isn't just about one man anymore," she began, each word deliberate, her cadence building like a slow-burning fire. "This isn't just about Donald Trump or Jim Jordan or even the judges they're trying to destroy. This is about a system, corrupt to its core, that props up the powerful while crushing the rest of us under the weight of its greed." The crowd roared its approval, a wall of sound that shook the room, but she didn't pause for applause. She pressed forward, eyes blazing, voice rising. "It's a system that's been preserved not just by Republicans, but by complacent Democrats too, by career politicians who trade spine for sponsorship, who mouth platitudes while protecting the status quo." Then, without hesitation, she named names. "And let's talk about Elon Musk," she continued, her voice now sharp enough to draw blood. "Let's talk about a billionaire who's convinced he can buy influence and call it innovation. A man who thinks he can tweet policy into existence from his golden throne in Silicon Valley, while millions of Americans are rationing insulin, skipping meals, or being evicted. He's not a genius, he's a symptom of a system that confuses wealth with wisdom, that hands the megaphone to the few and silences the rest." AOC's words hit like a jolt, igniting the crowd into a frenzy of applause and shouts. Some stood on chairs, others waved handmade signs, and nearly everyone was on their feet, galvanized by the sense that they were no longer alone in their anger. This wasn't just a speech. It was a declaration of war, against oligarchy, against complicity, and against the cynical belief that nothing could ever change. The response was immediate. A roar exploded from the crowd, an eruption of fury and relief, as if her words had given voice to something people were too tired or too afraid to say out loud. Cheers, whistles, and chants of "tax the rich" and "power to the people" filled the air like thunder. AOC didn't flinch. She thrived in the storm. Seated next to her, Bernie Sanders leaned forward, gripping the mic with familiar urgency. His white hair caught the stage lights, a glowing crown of defiance. "We are here tonight to say enough is enough," he thundered, his Brooklyn accent slicing through the roar like a battle cry. "The oligarchy is tightening its grip on every aspect of American life. We see it in the White House. We see it in Silicon Valley. We feel it in our wallets every single day." The audience surged again, this time louder, more visceral. Their tour had become more than a campaign. It was a rebellion, a rising tide of anti-establishment fury that cut across class and party lines, uniting disillusioned millennials, working-class families, and furious independents in one common cause: to rip the mask off a system that served power over people. But not everyone was cheering. Across the country, far from the raw energy of the desert, in a silent, dimly lit corner of Washington's power center, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer stood in his private Capitol Hill office, his jaw tight as he watched the Nevada Town Hall on a massive screen. The plush leather furniture, the expensive bourbon on the side table, the thick mahogany paneling, all of it felt suffocating tonight, like relics of a world being ripped away. He muted the sound just as AOC launched into a particularly biting critique of Democratic donors and the Wall Street pipeline into the party's soul. Her face filled the screen, animated, furious, rising. Radical, Schumer muttered under his breath, pacing like a caged animal, the glow of the screen flickering off his glasses. Utterly self-destructive. They're tearing us apart from the inside. And for years he had played the long game, brokering deals, preserving influence, placating donors while throwing just enough red meat to the base to survive. But this was an insurgency. And it wasn't coming from Republicans or Trump or even the far-right chaos agents. It was coming from within, from the progressive left, clawing at the party's foundation with populist rage and a thirst for purity that Schumer couldn't control. He reached for the secure phone on his desk, a line reserved for only the most critical calls. He stared at the blinking light for a moment, then punched in a number he hadn't dialed directly in years. A direct line to the DNC's deepest vault, where the real levers were pulled, far from the cameras and the podiums. The phone rang once. "Get me Langford," Schumer said, his voice like gravel. A pause. "Yes, that Langford. We've got a problem. And if we don't handle it now, AOC will burn this party to the ground with the cameras rolling." The screen continued playing in the background, now showing Bernie and AOC side by side, arms raised, soaking in the roar of a nation hungry for revolution. The battle lines within the Democratic Party were no longer hypothetical. They were drawn. And the war had begun. Chapter 2. Donald Trump's familiar voice. "Get me the president," Schumer barked to his aide, his voice low but vibrating with urgency. Within minutes, the secure line connected, and that unmistakable voice, half smirk, half sledgehammer, boomed into Schumer's ear with all the swagger and smugness of a man who'd never seen a political fight he couldn't turn into a spectacle. "Chuck," Trump drawled, drawing out the name like a punchline, "what brings you to my humble abode? Thought you were busy trying to impeach me for breakfast again." He laughed, a throaty, deliberate chuckle that sounded equal parts amused and annoyed. There was always that playful edge to Trump's tone, but Schumer knew better. Underneath the bravado was steel, dangerous and calculating. Schumer gritted his teeth, glancing at the muted TV still playing highlights from the Nevada town hall, where AOC and Bernie had just set the progressive internet on fire. "Mr. President," he said, trying to keep his voice even, "we have a situation. Ocasio-Cortez and Sanders, they're out of control. Their rhetoric tonight, fighting oligarchy, they're calling you and Musk the enemy of democracy, the enemy of working people. I've never seen the base this riled up, and they're pointing the cannon at both of us." Trump gave another amused chuckle, but there was a growing sharpness beneath it now. "Enemy?" he echoed, then scoffed. "Chuck, they're just jealous of the deals I make, the rockets Elon sends into space, the jobs we're creating in red states and blue ones. They don't build, they tear down. They're socialists, pure and simple. They'd rather burn the village than see someone else in charge. But go on, Schumer, tell me what's really got your silk socks in a twist." Schumer inhaled slowly, choosing his words with care. "They're not just stirring up the left, they're fracturing the middle. We're already bleeding suburban moderates. But now they're dragging the whole conversation leftward, talking about breaking up tech giants, seizing assets, punishing innovation. They're not just coming after you, they're coming after the donors. My donors. Our donors. And if this keeps up, we'll have a civil war in the party by convention season." Trump paused, the line silent for just a beat too long. Schumer could practically hear the wheels turning. "Chuck," Trump said finally, voice quieter, more serious, "you've got a progressive insurrection on your hands. And you know what happens when you try to reason with revolutionaries? They don't negotiate. They demand. They turn the crowd on you next. So here's what I think. Maybe it's time we find a little common ground." Schumer blinked, caught off guard. "Common ground? You want to protect your donors? I want to protect America. They want chaos. We want control. Maybe it's time the old guard remembered what it takes to stay in power." There it was, the offer. Unspoken, dangerous, tempting, and perhaps, in the shifting sands of 2028 politics, inevitable. Chapter 3. "We need to stop them." Mr. President Schumer laid it out with the precision of a man used to surviving in the blood-slicked arena of Capitol Hill. His voice, once tight with fury, was now controlled, methodical. He detailed the growing crowds, the viral clips, the grassroots fundraising explosion powering the Fighting Oligarchy tour. "They're pulling in the kind of numbers we haven't seen since Obama's first run," he warned. They're filling arenas in battleground states, tapping into this deep, dangerous disillusionment with the system, our system. And they're not just attacking you, Mr. President, they're going after me. Pelosi, Biden's legacy, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, the entire framework. If we don't get ahead of this, it won't matter what either of our parties does in 2028. They'll burn it all down and call it justice. Trump, seated behind the resolute desk, listened with an almost unnerving stillness, tapping a heavy gold pen against a legal pad. His eyes narrowed slightly, not out of anger, but amusement. Schumer had come crawling, and Trump was savoring it. "Dangerous, huh?" he said, finally breaking the silence with that familiar smirk. "Intriguing. You know, Chuck, for all your disagreements with me, and there have been a lot, you do occasionally have a point." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Tell you what, come down to the White House tomorrow. Let's talk more about these radical, extreme traitors, as you so eloquently put it." Schumer hesitated, just for a breath, but he knew he'd already crossed the threshold. "I'll be there." The next day, the skies over Washington were gray and heavy, the kind that always seemed to mirror the political mood of the Capitol. Schumer arrived at the White House flanked by a minimal security detail, walking through the west entrance like a man headed to an uneasy truce. The air inside the Oval Office was thick, not just with disinfectant and recycled air, but with unspoken calculations. Trump stood behind his desk, surprisingly cordial. There were no barbs, no backhanded compliments, just a firm handshake and a gesture to sit. "Chuck," Trump said, lowering himself into his seat, "you're right to be worried. These kids, AOC, Bernie, they've got nothing to lose and no respect for how this town works. They want a revolution. You and I, we're not fans of revolutions. We prefer deals." Before Schumer could respond, Trump reached for another phone on his desk, sleek, private, and unmistakably direct. He pressed a button and leaned in. "Elon, Donald here. Got a friend in the neighborhood. Chuck Schumer. Yeah, the Senate Minority Leader. He's concerned. Thinks you and I are being unfairly targeted by socialists. Fancy joining us?" "Yeah, right now." "Excellent." Schumer blinked, incredulous. "You're bringing in Musk? Now?" Trump smiled like a cat with a mouthful of feathers. "Chuck, my friend, this isn't about policy, this is about power. And if we're going to stop these revolutionaries from turning this country into a tech-regulated gulag, we need the guy who builds rockets, runs Twitter, and controls half the infrastructure they depend on." Within 15 minutes, Elon Musk was in the room. No tie, navy suit, confident stride. He took in Schumer with a brief nod and Trump with a bemused grin. "Didn't expect this combo," he said, lowering himself into a leather chair. "What's the emergency? Bernie finally learned how to use blockchain?" Trump chuckled. Schumer didn't. "We have a problem," Schumer said, his voice clipped. "Your name is being used as a bludgeon. They're calling you a tech king, a puppet master, saying you write executive orders from orbit, and it's working. They're making you the villain in a story that ends with them owning Congress and the White House. You'll be regulated into irrelevance. We'll be irrelevant." Musk raised an eyebrow, glancing at Trump. "He's not wrong." Trump leaned forward, tapping his fingers on the desk. "So here's what we do. We hit back, not with insults, with proof. We build a bipartisan firewall, a public unity initiative, innovation, infrastructure, citizenship integrity, you name it. We drown out the radicals with results. You in?" Musk smiled slowly. "Let's burn the revolutionaries with sunlight." And just like that, an unholy alliance began to take shape. An alliance born not of ideology, but of survival. The establishment had been challenged. Now it was preparing to strike back. Chapter 4. Chuck here seems to think we have a problem. Within 20 minutes, Elon Musk arrived at the White House, slipping into the Oval Office with the calm precision of someone accustomed to high-stakes rooms. He looked slightly rumpled, his blazer faintly creased, the collar of his shirt skewed just enough to hint at a rushed transit. But there was no mistaking the sharp alertness in his eyes. They flicked across the room, absorbing everything. The subtle tension in the air, the faint scent of leather and power, the way Trump reclined just a bit too comfortably in his chair like a man staging dominance. Musk extended a hand, shaking Trump's with the briskness of formality, then offered a minimal, almost dismissive nod to Schumer, whose jaw tensed slightly at the gesture. The atmosphere, thick already, took on a static charge as the three of them settled in. Trump was the first to speak, leaning back in his chair, hands steepled over his stomach, his expression that familiar blend of amusement and calculated provocation. "Gentlemen," he he began, his voice rolling through the room like a warm engine. Chuck here seems to think we've got a problem on our hands. AOC and Bernie, going around on their little media crusades, tossing out words like oligarch and traitor like they're candy at a parade. He chuckled, low and derisive, shaking his head with theatrical disbelief. It's absurd. Elon, you're the victim here, really. All you've ever done is try to innovate, try to build a better future. And now these people, these populists with TikToks and torches, are painting you as the villain in their little revolution. Musk didn't smile, didn't blink. He remained impassive, his voice even and devoid of inflection. It's distracting, unhelpful. But I'm used to it. Building anything that matters attracts heat. I've seen it before. He paused, eyes locking with Trump's for a moment, then drifting to Schumer. This isn't new. What's different now is the volume. Schumer, who had been silent thus far, shifted forward in his seat. His posture was tense, shoulders drawn tight, eyes scanning both men before he spoke. It's more than just noise, Mr. Musk, he said, the words coming fast, as if he'd been holding them in too long. It's not just criticism, it's corrosion. They're undermining the public's faith in the system itself, and it's working. I've seen the data. The protests, the online activity, the rhetoric, they're not just frustrated anymore, they're radicalized. It's systemic now, viral. If we don't get ahead of this, if we don't reframe the narrative, we risk losing control, not just of the political discourse, but of public order. He looked pointedly at Musk. People listen to you. You have reach. You have mythos. If you speak, they'll hear it. Musk's brow twitched, just slightly, betraying a flicker of something, annoyance maybe, or contemplation. I didn't come here to play politics. I build rockets and cars. I run companies. I'm not here to solve Washington's messaging crisis. Trump raised a hand in a half-dismissive wave, grinning. But you're already in it, Elon. Whether you like it or not, you're part of the story. You've got more influence than most countries. When you tweet, markets move. When you speak, the world listens. These people, they don't see a CEO. They see a king with a flamethrower. That made Musk snort just barely, but he didn't respond. Instead, his gaze shifted to the fireplace, to the portrait of Lincoln looming above it. A long pause filled the room. Then Schumer leaned in further, lowering his voice. We're not asking you to lie. Just clarify. Recenter the conversation. Make it clear that tearing down institutions won't lead to utopia, that chaos isn't progress. Musk turned back toward him slowly, his expression unreadable. What do I get out of it? The question hung in the air like smoke. Trump chuckled again, tapping a finger on the polished desk. You get to keep building. You get protection, leverage, and you get to remind the world that you're not the villain they're looking for. Another beat passed. Musk inhaled through his nose, then exhaled slowly. I'll think about it, he said. But I'm not going to be your puppet. Not for this. Schumer opened his mouth to respond, but Trump raised a hand, stopping him. That's fair, he said, his voice now lower, more serious. But think fast. The clock's ticking, and if we don't move soon, they will. Musk gave a small nod, then turned and walked out of the room as silently as he had entered, leaving Trump and Schumer in the charged silence of power recalibrating itself. Chapter 5. Trump, ever the showman, focused on the public theater. Drain the swamp, Trump interjected, finishing Schumer's sentence with a knowing smile that lingered just a moment too long, as if savoring the old slogan's return. That's what we need to do, Chuck. Drain the swamp. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial murmur. And I think we might just have a plan. That single sentence hung in the air like a spark waiting for fuel. And over the next few hours, as the sun sank low over Washington and the shadows in the Oval Office lengthened, that spark caught flame. A plan began to take shape, not in sweeping declarations or formal briefings, but on crumpled White House notepads, in fragments of conversation exchanged in hushed tones, with sideways glances and the kind of unspoken consensus that only exists between people who understand the stakes. This wasn't brute force, not yet. They didn't talk of arrests or suppression or overt censorship. This was about narrative warfare, psychological architecture. It was about exposing hypocrisy, exploiting vulnerabilities, and bending the machinery of the very system that AOC and Sanders had built their movement railing against. If the progressives wanted to burn it all down, then the best defense was to show the world that they were holding the match. Musk, who had initially reclined into his silence like a man visiting an alien land, began to lean forward, literally and mentally. The political arena, he realized, was just another complex system. It had rules, variables, feedback loops. It could be modeled, gamed, optimized. What at first had looked like noise began to resolve into patterns. He spoke with growing interest, suggesting a data-driven strategy using deep analytics, AI-driven modeling, and real-time monitoring to dissect the digital footprint of the so-called fighting oligarchy movement. Identify the keystone nodes in their network, the influencers, the signal boosters, map their narratives, anticipate their talking points, and hit them preemptively with counter-messaging designed not to argue, but to confuse, to reframe, to fragment. Disinformation? No. This was information superiority. Trump, ever the ringmaster, was already thinking about optics. He didn't want to just neutralize the movement. He wanted to humiliate it, discredit it, turn it into a punchline. He proposed a series of splashy initiatives, job summits, tech expos, a cross-country innovation tour featuring working-class Americans building the future through entrepreneurship. Highlight the good. Showcase progress. Frame the message like a campaign. This is what works, and this is what socialism threatens to take away. We'll drown their noise with spectacle, Trump declared, his voice rising with excitement. Big ideas, big crowds, positive energy. Let them try to compete with that. He grinned, basking in the idea of turning AOC's own firebrand tactics against her. Schumer, the veteran of 1,000 quiet wars, was already moving pieces on his mental chessboard. He knew how the Hill worked, how the media fed off leaks like sharks in bloodied water. He outlined how he could trigger congressional hearings that would force the movement's rising stars into the spotlight, not on their own terms but as defendants of their own inconsistencies. He spoke of quiet conversations with donors, of pressure campaigns within the party to fracture their base. He could leverage editorials, think tanks, strategic memos. He knew which allies to call and which knives to twist. All the while, the three of them, so different in demeanor, yet suddenly aligned in purpose, began to sink. Trump, the populist provocateur, always looking for the spotlight but understanding its cost. Musk, the tech visionary, now fascinated by the mechanics of political manipulation. And Schumer, the pragmatic operator, comfortable in the gray spaces where deals are born and enemies are unmade. What started as a meeting of convenience began to evolve into an alliance of necessity. They weren't united by ideology. Far from it. But they were bound by a shared understanding that the growing energy behind AOC and Sanders wasn't just a political nuisance. It was a force with potential to destabilize everything they had built, represented, or controlled. It wasn't just about keeping power, it was about keeping the system coherent. The enemy was no longer just a couple of loud voices in the progressive wing. It was a movement that had learned how to weaponize moral certainty, youth energy, and viral media into something dangerously effective. And now, in the quiet hours of an Oval Office no longer just symbolic, the counteroffensive had begun, not with bombs or bills, but with strategy, precision, and a cold, unspoken promise. If AOC and Sanders wanted to play with fire, they would learn what it meant to get burned. Chapter 6. Musk's Team Using Cutting-Edge AI. The first strike was subtle. A series of anonymously sourced articles began appearing in mainstream media, questioning the financial transparency of the Fighting Oligarchy tour. Were they truly grassroots funded, or were there hidden donors with ulterior motives? The articles didn't accuse directly, but they planted seeds of suspicion. Then came the data. Musk's team, using cutting-edge AI, unearthed inconsistencies in the social media narratives propagated by AOC and Sanders' supporters. Tweets and posts that appeared organic were traced back to automated bots and coordinated campaigns, suggesting a level of manipulation that belied the image of a spontaneous grassroots uprising. This information, carefully leaked to select journalists, began to erode the movement's credibility. Schumer, meanwhile, worked the inside game. He quietly reached out to moderate Democrats, whispering warnings about the radical direction the party was heading, the electoral damage AOC and Sanders were inflicting. He reminded them of the importance of party unity, subtly hinting at the consequences of aligning with such divisive figures. As the pressure mounted, cracks began to appear in the Fighting Oligarchy facade. Internal disagreements within the movement surfaced. Accusations of hypocrisy and infighting leaked out. The unified front began to fray. AOC and Sanders fought back, of course. They held more rallies, their rhetoric even more impassioned, accusing Trump, Musk, and the establishment of a coordinated smear campaign. But their message, once so resonant, now seemed to be losing its edge, tainted by the whispers of scandal and the accusations of manipulation. Chapter 7. Musk, calm and articulate. The climax came not with a bang, but with a deceptively calm congressional hearing broadcast live to a nation hungry for spectacle. Ostensibly focused on technology regulation, a dry, technical affair for most, those paying attention understood it for what it truly was: political theater meticulously staged to shift the tides of public perception. The committee chamber buzzed with anticipation, the tension palpable beneath the hum of cameras and the rustling of papers. Musk sat alone at the witness table, flanked by aides in the background but very much the center of gravity. Calm, precise, and unflinchingly composed, he presented himself not as a billionaire mogul defending his empire, but as a visionary engineer walking the country through a tour of its own future. He spoke of battery innovation, of Martian colonization, of AI frameworks designed to serve humanity, jobs created, industries revitalized. His language was technical, optimistic, and scrupulously apolitical. When pressed on his political affiliations or alleged alignment with any faction, Musk offered smooth redirections, focusing instead on his relentless pursuit of progress and problem-solving. He wasn't here to play politics, he implied. He was here to build the tools that politics would inevitably depend on. It was working. The narrative was holding. And then, the twist. During a particularly pointed line of questioning, ostensibly unrelated, a Republican congressman from Texas interrupted the flow with a carefully prepared dossier. He presented it with theatrical nonchalance, as if it were an afterthought, but the effect was immediate and electric. The evidence, he claimed, linked a senior organizer of the Fighting Oligarchy tour to a known foreign intelligence front, an adversary long accused of manipulating Western discourse through digital propaganda. The connection was circumstantial, a blurred timeline of financial records and online activity that left just enough ambiguity to avoid legal liability, but more than enough to ignite media frenzy. The room went still. Journalists in the press gallery scrambled to update live blogs. Phones buzzed like hives. Musk remained motionless, as if unfazed. But the pivot in the hearing was undeniable. The conversation, which had begun as a defense of technological innovation, transformed in real time into an autopsy of the progressive movement's credibility. The questions shifted. Senators began probing not just Musk's intentions, but the authenticity of those who had attacked him so vocally. The implication, seeded just enough to sprout, was that the anti-oligarchy crusade might itself have been a puppet show. Within hours, the headlines metastasized. Cable news split-screened Musk's composed testimony with grainy screenshots of alleged communications between the tour organizer and dubious overseas contacts. Analysts speculated. Commentators debated. The story was no longer about billionaires versus populists. It was about infiltration, deception, and the unsettling question of who was pulling whose strings. In the days that followed, the Fighting Oligarchy tour faltered. Bookings were quietly canceled. Key endorsements evaporated. Online engagement dipped. Internal discontent spilled into the open as organizers turned on one another, scrambling to distance themselves from the fallout. AOC and Sanders, never ones to retreat, fought back with furious resolve. They held emergency rallies, gave impassioned speeches denouncing the smear as yet another attempt by the establishment to crush dissent. But something had shifted. Their words, though still fiery, now felt defensive. The media, once enthralled by their populist fervor, began applying a sharper lens. The same platforms that had amplified their message now scrutinized every claim, every financial disclosure, every past association. They were still visible, still vocal, but the aura of invincibility had cracked. In the Oval Office, days later, the mood was decidedly lighter. Trump, Musk, and Schumer gathered once again, but this time without the tension of their first meeting. There was a quiet smugness in the air, the shared understanding of a successful operation executed without leaving fingerprints. They clinked glasses of sparkling water, not out of celebration exactly, but as a subtle acknowledgement of a goal achieved. "Not bad, gentlemen," Trump said, his grin wide and unrestrained, like a man basking in the afterglow of controlled chaos. "Not bad at all. Drained a little swamp water, wouldn't you say?" Musk nodded, his expression unreadable, but his satisfaction evident. "Strategic application of leverage," he replied, allowing a rare, almost amused smile to curve his lips. "Effective." Schumer, who had perhaps surprised even himself in how far he'd been willing to go, allowed a small chuckle to escape. "A win for stability," he said, his voice carefully neutral, though the glint in his eyes betrayed a sense of vindication. They didn't dwell on what came next, because they all knew. The battle wasn't over. Political dramas never truly ended, they simply shifted stages. There would be another chapter, another uprising, another rival to contain. But for this moment, they had prevailed. They had taken on a movement with raw momentum, broken it down, and turned it into a cautionary tale. The swamp, for all its murk, had given way. Just a bit. Not drained, no, not entirely. But some of the muck had been scooped out and cast aside, and in Washington, that was more than enough to call it a victory.